Hello, I'm Kristina Pérez. I'm the author of the Sweet Black Waves trilogy, and I'm very excited to be reading from the conclusion to the trilogy, Bright Raven Skies, for the first time for Super Relaxed Fantasy Club. Now, at the end of book 2, Monmouthoo Castle is under attack, and Branwen makes a perhaps somewhat rash decision to make a deal with the God of the Dead. Now, book 3 picks up right the morning after, and Tristan and Isolde are missing. The castle is smoldering, and Branwen and Ruan are searching the coastline of Cerniv for any sign of the queen or her champion. So we're picking up about halfway through their search, which is halfway through the first chapter. An hour passed as she and Ruan rode in silence, listening to the harmony of bird calls, the sun hanging ever lower in the sky. Suddenly a shrill whinny broke into the bird's evening song, discordant and nerve-tingling. Branwen's tongue took on a metallic taste. She had no choice but to follow him into the copse. Branwen's mare had bolted when she'd used the hand of Briga against the queen's assassins. Her fire magic had startled Sonara. The horse stomped a hoof, tossing her head, a slightly wild look in her eye, as if she'd been waiting, impatient. Perhaps she had scented Branwen in the forest. Branwen was fond of the high-spirited mare named for the hero Lugmarch's mother. Ruan brought his mount alongside Sonara. Her umber coat shone. He stretched a pacifying hand toward the mare, and she allowed him to stroke her muzzle. He looked to Branwen for an explanation. Her pulse raced. "You said you'd been thrown from Sonara, not that you'd abandoned her in the forest," he said. That had indeed been the excuse Branwen had invented for her disheveled appearance the night before. "I'd wondered why you'd chosen a different mount today." A line appeared above Ruan's nose. "How did you get back to the castle?" "I walked." He screwed up his lips in annoyance. Ruan started and cut himself off. His eyes had latched onto something on the ground. Bile rushed up Branwen's throat. On the tenebrous forest floor, between Sonara's hooves, was something darker still. A charred body. Ruan leapt down from his horse, hand instinctively touching his sword. Branwen brushed her fingers over her mother's brooch, which clasped her cloak closed. It was all that she had left of Lady Alana. Branwen slid out of the saddle, feigning confusion. Ruan led Sonara away so that he could inspect the body, what was left of it. The corpse's mouth was frozen in a scream. Branwen suppressed one of her own, tasting her own disgust. She had done that. The hand of Briga had burned him alive. She had defended herself with her most potent weapon when he attacked her. It was her life or his. And yet, Branwen hoped her parents couldn't see her from the other world, couldn't see the full brutality of her magic. Ruan dropped to one knee beside the body. It was unidentifiable. His shoulders grew stiff as he withdrew a sword from beneath the corpse. Flakes of burned flesh clung to the steel. Revulsion passed over his features. He didn't look at Branwen. She stood stock still. Her heart pounded, yet she didn't tremble. Ruan pushed to the balls of his feet and stalked through the clearing. The air around them grew tauter than a bowstring just before an arrow was released. Branwen knew what Ruan would find a few strides away. He knelt beside another body. She saw his chest rise and fall. She felt as if she were stunned, caught in the lethal enchantment of a Kratara's gaze. She could only watch as Ruan tried to unravel her lies. Then something winked at Branwen, a flash of gold against the coming night. She staggered toward it, almost sleepwalking. The gold glinted again from a nest of leaves. She didn't notice Ruan was behind her until his chest was pressed to her back, and he snatched the golden object from the low-lying branch. He spun Branwen around violently to face him. "My father's knife," he said. The lion emblazed on its handle was the royal standard of Iveru, and it looked ferocious indeed, but not half as ferocious as Ruan's expression. "You told me you didn't know where it was." The knife was precious to Ruan, and he had gifted it to Branwen. "You lied to me." Branwen had told Ruan more lies than she could count. Lies to protect her cousin, lies to protect Tristan, lies to protect Iveru. And yet she found solace in Ruan's arms. He knew parts of her nobody else did. He kissed her scars. "Branwen, what happened here?" The words were rough. As much as she wanted to punish her cousin for trying to have her killed, Iveru needed Isolde to remain on the Cernivac throne. Iveru's needs mattered more than her own. When Branwen didn't reply, Ruan pressed her. "The dead men were carrying swords forged from Cartagon steel," he said. "I recognize the blacksmith's mark. He makes the weapons for the royal guard. Tutor and Bloodroast never reported for their watch yesterday. Ruan drew in a long breath. Tell me why there are 2 dead guardsmen, my father's knife, and your horse in the same copse, Branwen. She wet her lips, crafting a plausible story. I was thrown by Sonara, like I told you. The knife must have slipped from my boot when I fell. Branwen spoke slowly, deliberately. I can't say why the guardsmen were here. I didn't see them. Conflict brimmed in Ruan's eyes. He wanted to believe Branwen. She knew he did. He fidgeted the knife handle back and forth. Why did you walk back to the castle, he asked. Night was falling and Sonara had run off. His gaze locked with Branwen's. Why were you in the forest alone when we were on the brink of war? Because she'd wanted more than anything to make amends. Branwen had resolved to conjure an antidote to the loving cup, to release Tristan and Iseult from their false love, from the spell she had cast because she wanted her cousin to know happiness in her marriage to King Mark. The drink of peace that now promised more bloodshed. But why had Branwen cared so much for Iseult's happiness? Why had she risked her life time and again for a woman as selfish as the queen? No answer came. She swallowed several more times. It was wrong to use Ruan's feelings for her against him, but she saw no other option. Yet another thing her cousin had stolen from her. Softly, she said, Remember when I told you I had a favorite cave in Iveru where I liked to escape? Ruan nodded. I know it was foolish, but sometimes I feel caged on Monwaku, she continued. I wanted to feel free, for an hour or 2. Can you understand that? Ruan's jaw slackened. I can, but Branwen, something grisly happened here, and I think Sonara returned to the last place she knew you were. Branwen took a large step backward. Is this when you accuse me of treason again, Prince Ruan? He inhaled shortly. She had intended to wound him with the use of his title, his fake title. Ruan! It was King Mark. Panic streaked across his champion's face. He tucked the knife into his waistband. Branwen prayed the king wasn't in danger, but she couldn't be more appreciative for the distraction. You take Sonara, Ruan barked at her. We'll come back for the stallion. In a blur of motion, Ruan tied the reins of the horse Branwen had been riding to a branch. Don't leave my sight, he said as Branwen flung a leg over her mare. Senarinade. Treason it is, then, Branwen concluded. Ruan growled something that might have been her name, or maybe a curse. He slapped Sonara into a canter and jumped back into his own saddle. He kept Branwen's mount in front of his, driving them both hard toward the direction where Mark's voice had originated. In a matter of minutes, they joined a group of royal guardsmen, dressed in the black and white that indicated the king's service, clustered around a tree. Could it be Tristan or Iseult? Mark stood with his guards, sword at his side. Normally the king didn't bear arms, trusting his retainers to protect him, but Mark no longer knew whom he could trust. Someone had provoked the war with Armorica, and it wasn't the king. Ruan, Mark said, glancing toward his champion. He was a young king, only 27, but he looked completely haggard. His silver eyes were dull, and he tugged at his beard. He said something to Ruan rapidly in Kernavik, and then switched to Aquilan for Branwen's benefit. The Aquilan Empire had ruled the island of Albion, as well as much of the southern continent, until a century ago, and its language was still the common tongue among the nobility of many kingdoms. We found an Armorican, he told her. We need a translator. Branwen released a heavy breath. Did the Armorican know where the true queen was? Doubtful, but at least the discovery of her cousin's betrayal had been delayed for another day. Branwen dismounted and came to stand beside Mark. She heard Ruan grunt, but he shouldn't complain. She hadn't left his sight. Branwen tilted her head at the king, asking for permission to approach the prisoner. He stepped aside, letting her into the circle. The prisoner was slim. His knees were tucked into his chest, head bowed, leaning against the trunk of a tree. 8 sword tips were pointed at him. Branwen's eyes were drawn to the prisoner's hands, folded over his knees. The fingers were tapered, his skin golden brown, elegant. She slid her gaze upward to the yellow knit cap on the Armorican's head, then darted it back down toward his hands. Branwen stepped toward the prisoner. Don't get too close, Ruan cautioned from behind her. She snorted. Sister, King Mark said. Branwen's heart clenched. He genuinely regarded her as such. She crouched in front of the prisoner. Gently, she touched a hand to the Armorican's scraped knuckles. The prisoner snapped his head up, and Branwen saw that his nose was broken. She also realized that the prisoner was a woman. I'm a healer. Are you in pain? Branwen said in Nivernic, reaching toward her nose. She repeated the question in Aquilan, and recognition blazed in the woman's eyes. The captive had understood Branwen, which meant she was no common sailor, and there was no need for a translator. The woman flinched as Branwen leaned closer, and her cap skewed to one side, a messy braid falling against her shoulder. A few gasps rose up from the guardsmen. Hatred shone in the woman's eyes as she watched Branwen watching her. Frenzied memories from last night rushed through Branwen. The lithe Armorican who had assaulted King Mark, the woman's scream when Crown Prince Cahedrin was felled, and Cahedrin's final words. "Now you'll deal Princess Alba," Branwen said. The other woman bared her teeth and spat in Branwen's face. Onward, Armorica. Thank you, and Bright Raven Skies is out August 25th, 2020, if you want to see how the rest of the book goes. Thank you very much.